Welcome back to Era 4 of APUS History. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 4.8, Jackson and Federal Power, paying particular attention to the debates about the role of the federal government in shaping policy and how the battles between the political parties influenced that policy. So let's get to it. Jackson's supporters had spent 4 years of John Quincy Adams' presidency opposing his policies, which seemed much more like those embraced by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists years earlier. And they believed more in a limited government. So in effect, by resisting John Quincy Adams' initiatives, they were campaigning for future support for Andrew Jackson. So much so that when the election of 1828 came around, the single party had evolved into the Democratic Party supporting Jackson and its opponents, then calling themselves the National Republicans, eventually forming the Whig Party. The campaign focused less on the issues and more on what we would see as modern-day mudslinging, attacking some of the decisions that these men had made. Jackson was called a murderer because he'd ordered the execution of soldiers for crimes during the times when he had been a soldier, as well as killing more than one rival in duels. Adams had supposedly arranged for prostitutes when he had served as a diplomat to the Tsar of Russia. The mudslinging even turned to the wives, with Adams' wife accused of being born out of wedlock, making her a questionable choice for a man in polite society, while Jackson's wife was accused of having an affair with Jackson himself, because she'd been married previously, and her divorce actually had not been finalized at the time that Jackson and Rachel got married, although they ended up fixing that. By the time that this election was happening in 1828, all of this was extremely old news for both candidates, but it did generate quite a bit of interest in the election. This, combined with other factors, led to an increase of over 300% in the voter turnout rates. Jackson ultimately will win very easily, carrying every state west of the Appalachians, as well as the South. His reputation as a war hero and as a man of the frontier, since he wasn't from Eastern elite society, is ultimately what won him the election. And really, it had nothing to do with his position on the issues, because the campaign never focused on that. Even before the election, the battles between the parties had resulted in a battle over one of the key components of Henry Clay's American system, the tariff. In 1828, Southern opponents of tariffs had decided to challenge the use of protective tariffs by proposing a new tariff law that was so high that even Northern supporters of tariffs would be obligated to vote against it. The goal was to write a bill so bad, so abominable, that it would never pass and therefore would hurt the Adams-Clay coalition. Much to the supporters' surprise, it passed Congress, and then President Adams signed it, making it a major issue for the upcoming presidential election. Upon taking office, Jackson actually left this tariff in place because he believed it to be constitutional, if unpopular. Vice President John C. Calhoun secretly wrote a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, urging his home state to nullify the tariff within South Carolina. And remember, there was a precedent for such actions. It had been set way back in 1799 with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Radical factions in South Carolina did exactly what Calhoun had suggested, calling this tariff the Tariff of Abominations. A tremendous debate in Congress ensued, primarily between Robert Hayne of South Carolina and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. That actually had started out as a debate over the sale of Western land, but became connected to the tariff issue because of the nullification doctrine, as well as this national versus sectional interests, which the tariff definitely was. Webster supported a more nationalistic point of view, while Hayne was more sectionalist. Many people expected Jackson to side with Hayne, but once the debate shifted to secession and nullification, he sided with Webster. A slightly lower tariff was passed by Congress and signed by Jackson in 1832, which was also opposed by South Carolina and prompted Calhoun to finally resign as vice president. Jackson tried to appeal to the people of South Carolina, informing them that nullification and disunion were treasonous. Then Congress passed legislation that authorized the president to use whatever force he deemed necessary to enforce federal laws, including tariff laws, essentially allowing for possible military action against South Carolina. Henry Clay, though, stepped in and helped to broker a compromise tariff, which was signed into law in 1833, which would help defuse the crisis. But Jackson predicted that the issue of states' rights, which this tariff represented, really hadn't been resolved and would return, but likely over the question of slavery. And oh, how right he was. But the tariff wasn't the only aspect of the American system that was challenged by Jackson. Internal improvements, meaning the transportation network, was also a target, as Jackson believed that the powers of the federal government should be quite limited. And as a result, he vetoed lots of legislation that would grow the size of the federal government. An example of this was the Maysville Road Bill that would create a federally funded road through Kentucky. Although it would join the already existing national road at the Ohio River, supporters argued that this expanded road network would help the country grow at a faster rate and it would help the economy to be stronger and more self-sufficient. But opponents noted this entire Maysville Road project was located completely within just one state, the state of Kentucky, making this an intrastate project, not an interstate project. And while Congress could regulate interstate trade, this wasn't. And Jackson agreed with that position, vetoing the legislation. It also probably didn't hurt Jackson's position that his longtime political rival, Henry Clay, was from Kentucky, and he did not like Henry Clay. Still another political battle over the role of the federal government came over the issue of the Bank of the United States. Jackson had been opposed to the bank from the very beginning, describing it as a hydra or a many-headed monster of corruption, dating back to its role in the Panic of 1819, and then followed by the tightening of credit, which tended to favor Eastern elites at the expense of Westerners, which, remember, Jackson himself is a Westerner. Remember, though, this Second Bank of the United States had been chartered back in 1816, and the charter was to last for a period of 20 years. So it was good through 1836. Jackson used his opposition, though, to the bank as a political tool to earn more votes for Democrats. Whig supporters of the bank convinced the president of the Bank of the United States, a man named Nicholas Biddle, to apply for its rechartering early in 1832 in order to make that an issue for that year's presidential election when Jackson was going to be facing off against Henry Clay. Congress passed the legislation, but Jackson vetoed it, claiming the bank pitted the wealthy elite against planters, farmers, the mechanic, and the laborer, benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the common people. The bank did continue, though, because, again, it still had 4 years left on its original charter. But fearing economic reprisals from Biddle, Jackson began to remove all federal deposits from the bank and arranged to distribute that money to dozens of state banks that were nicknamed pet banks by his opponents, which in turn caused Biddle to begin to call in loans and demand payments from state banks and others, which was the beginning of a financial crisis. And that financial crisis was going to be made even worse by the passage of a Jackson policy known as the Specie Circular. This is a new federal policy that would require Western land purchases to be made in only gold or silver, not paper banknotes, with the idea of slowing down speculation in Western lands. Ultimately, these combined policies triggered the Panic of 1837, which ended up almost destroying the presidency of Jackson's political protege, Martin Van Buren, and cost Martin Van Buren re-election in 1840. But of course, Jackson himself was largely untouched because he was out of office when the worst of this hit. A final example of the demonstration of federal power in the age of Jackson can be seen in the area of westward expansion and government policies towards Native Americans. Frontier settlers in both northern and southern parts of the country supported westward expansion, but that often created conflict with Native American groups who were already living in those areas. This is especially evident as Southern planters began pushing westward, looking for fresh land to expand the production of cotton, especially when you consider that the areas in the Southeast, places like South Carolina, were being depleted of nutrients and were much less productive at a time when the demand for cotton was increasing tremendously because of the growth of the factories and the market revolution in the textile industry up north. But in the way, of course, were the Native Americans, particularly the Cherokee in along the northern Georgia-Alabama border. Jackson sympathized with white American farmers on the frontier and felt that it was their right to expand westward as far as they could. So he felt Native Americans should give up their traditional homelands and resettle into areas that white settlers weren't interested in, which at the time was the area west of the Mississippi River, because it was believed that this was unfarmable. Remember, that steel plow had not yet been invented. The Indian Removal Act, which was signed by Jackson, would require most Eastern tribes to relocate to the area west of the Mississippi River. And by 1835, most of them had gone, their lands taken over by white farmers and plantation owners. But not everyone went quietly. There were some states that had passed similar laws to this Indian Removal Act, including the state of Georgia. And one tribe in particular there, the Cherokee, held on to their native territory that was in the northern part of Georgia, and they challenged not only the Georgia state laws requiring their removal, but also federal law, challenging it all the way to the Supreme Court. In the first case that ultimately reached the Supreme Court, the case of Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee were not a foreign nation and therefore not allowed to bring suit in federal court. This is when they were challenging state laws that would require them to give up their homelands. Essentially, what they were going to have to do is sue in state court first, and then once it reached the state Supreme Court, then they could appeal through the federal court system. Keep in mind that John Marshall is still Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and deciding cases from a more Federalist point of view at a time when Federalists don't exist. In a second case, Worcester v. Georgia, the court ruled that Georgia state laws did not apply in Cherokee territory. They weren't treated as an independent nation, but something where the federal government would regulate them, meaning only federal laws applied. Essentially, though, this doesn't change anything because federal laws said they had to give up their homeland. Jackson, though, wasn't particularly pleased by the Supreme Court, siding with the states, saying that they had the right to make laws within their boundaries. Still, the Cherokee were pretty much left alone while Jackson was still in office. Of course, after he leaves, that changes, because the goal for the locals was to seize control of Cherokee land. And in 1838, the U.S. Army began forcibly removing over 15,000 Cherokee from Georgia and forced them to march to the Oklahoma-Kansas area. The hardships were extremely great, and well over 4,000 Cherokee people perished along the way, leading to this march being nicknamed the Trail of Tears. And again, remember, this is happening after Jackson left office, so technically not a part of his presidency, but he was the one that had pushed so strongly for Indian removal and had signed it into law, and it was his protege that finally enforced this Jacksonian policy. So it is still affiliated with him because it was essentially his policy. One of the reasons, though, why the Cherokee were so in particular targeted and why they tried so hard to stay is that they had essentially adapted to Southern society, with many Cherokee owning slaves and having plantations, even intermarrying with prominent Southern families, especially in North Georgia, where their land was located. But many of the white settlers in that area did not like the idea of their daughters marrying Cherokee men, though it was acceptable for white men to marry Cherokee women. So there's a tremendous amount of racism associated with this removal. Also, once the Cherokee did leave, their plantations, their stock, their slaves would be sold all at the same time, essentially flooding the market. And that, in turn, is likely going to result in lower prices, which is an advantage to buyers, but a hardship on the sellers. Well, that about covers what you need to know about topic 4.8 and the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and in particular, the battles over federal power. Be sure to keep up with your assigned reading, and we'll catch you in the next video.